25 reasons to try out playing Yu-Gi-Oh! It's 2025, and so there's 25 reasons. Plus also, it's the 25th anniversary of Yu-Gi-Oh! For the third year in a row, actually. Reason number one, anime nostalgia. Because I know that you probably watched Yu-Gi-Oh! At some point as a kid. In fact, I meet a lot of people who really loved Yu-Gi-Oh! But just don't know that the card game exists today and is like still played. They're like, what? People still play Yu-Gi-Oh! They still make cards? Yeah, they do. In fact, all of your favorite characters, all of your favorite moments from the show are very much still intact. You can play a deck based around cards that Yugi used or Kaiba used, and that goes for Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, that goes for Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, Arc 5, Zexal, whatever. And you're still very much playing the same game. You're summoning monsters, you're activating spells, you're flipping trap cards to take your opponent by surprise, you can make really big comebacks. It's all still there. So if there's anything at all that you remember from just watching the TV show, it still does exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! Today. Number two, it's really affordable to get started anyway. You can pretty much start Yu-Gi-Oh! By just buying 3 copies of a structure deck that you see on store shelves. Some recent ones include things like Fire Kings or the Crimson King structure deck that's like based on Red Dragon Archfiend that Jack Atlas and Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds used, but really any structure deck released in the last few years will do. In fact, they're actually about to release a Blue Eyes White Dragon structure deck here in just a couple of weeks, which is like really cool because it's updated and super strong. So if you like Blue Eyes, and you probably did if you're watching this video and you like Yu-Gi-Oh! At all, then yeah, you know, it's pretty easy to play. Structure decks are only 12 bucks, you only gotta buy 3 of them, and you are ready to hit the races. Number 3 is custom deck building. A lot of trading card games I've noticed actually have a lot of restrictions on like what you can and can't put in your deck. And certainly Yu-Gi-Oh! Has some of those, but like whereas some games say, okay, your deck must be exactly 50 cards or exactly 100 cards, or you must commit, 10 spots of your deck to this type of thing. Not so much the case in Yu-Gi-Oh! You get a pretty wide variety of things you can run, like you can run 40 to 60 cards in your deck, any number in between those. And yes, you are limited to running 3 copies of a card, but there's no certain amount of monsters that you have to run or spells that you have to run. So you'll see really cool decks that run like all spell cards or all trap cards. In fact, it's not uncommon to see decks with like 40 or 60 monster cards. And I think that's really cool because you can build for balance, you can build kind of leaning into a certain direction. All of that is just, it's very expressive and very free with the deck building, and I like that. And speaking of deck building, there's actually a huge variety of decks that you can build in this game, like theme-wise. We've got decks that are literally based on Star Wars and the Wizard of Oz. We've got decks that are based on sushi. We've got decks that are based on like pastries and sweet treats. And we've also got decks that are like fighting game inspired. There's so much going on in Yu-Gi-Oh! That like if you just have any sort of interest, any kind of thing that you like in fantasy or in real life, sports, food, whatever it is, there is probably a Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck around it. Number 5, the rules are actually really accessible. Now, I know Yu-Gi-Oh! Gets a lot of flack for being really complicated or having long cards and things like that, but actually I would argue that the core rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! Have not changed and are really easy to understand. If you pick up a rule book and just read it, you'll totally understand what normal summons are, special summons, how attacks work, how chains work. I would say it's a very intuitive game. Now, the more that you learn about Yu-Gi-Oh!, the more that you can appreciate some of the finer nuances of the game, and sometimes those nuances are important to winning, right? Like you can exploit how a chain will necessarily resolve or use certain things in a certain order in the battle phase to get an advantage over your opponent. But just learning how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Is extremely simple. Number 6, some of your old favorite cards are probably updated now and really strong. So like I mentioned before, Blue Eyes White Dragon is getting a powerful new structure deck here pretty soon, but all of the old anime support cards at this point have gotten entire archetypes made from them, entire new lines of support that never actually appeared in the show. So for instance, if you want to play Dark Magician now, there's a cool fusion monster between Dark Magician and Red Eyes Black Dragon called Red Eyes Dark Dragoons, and it's extremely powerful. And also, Gaia the Fierce Knight, Blackluster Soldier, all of those old classics. I mean, even Grandpa Moto got an entire deck based on like the Millennium monsters that he used. So there's like a whole variety of things where you don't have to feel like you're being left in the dust just because you like an old theme like Gravekeepers or Harpy Ladies. They have new cards that you can use to update them and still be able to play them viably today. Reason number 7 is it builds friendships. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very much a social game. If you are going to your local card shop, it means that you're going to have to meet people and interact with them. And that means that you will make, some rivalries, you'll make some friends, you'll make some enemies. But the point is you're all sort of settling in at this card shop once a week or more. to get together and play your favorite game. So it's only natural that you will meet some cool people who will, at least if you're anything like me, go on to become lifelong friends. In fact, that leads into reason number 8, which is that it's a weekly event. It's something to do. A lot of times people find themselves just sort of like working and then eating and then sleeping, and like that's their life. But I think that going to the card shop every week is a good activity. It gets you out of the house, it can keep people out of trouble, and also it's just something that kind of gives you a little bit of routine, a little bit of a break or release, something that's like a reprieve from work, a reprieve from, family or annoying other people in your life, school, whatever it is. So yeah, for me, like I remember growing up and going to locals every single weekend was something that I legitimately looked forward to. Just that bit of normalcy, and also like sort of a goal to attain, like can I do a little bit better at locals this week? I'm looking forward to trading at locals this week. That whole thing gave me structure, and I really do appreciate Yu-Gi-Oh for that. Number 9 is the artwork. Yu-Gi-Oh art is incredible. I think that it's kind of cool because Yu-Gi-Oh art used to be this very like mystical, very scary, threatening, like ugly monsters. But nowadays, the artwork has changed to become a little bit more like anime inspired, but there's also like still dragons and machines, and just there are a lot of really cool things. Some of my favorite card artworks actually have just been released in the last few years. And something that I've found for Yu-Gi-Oh in particular is that the monsters have cool posing. A lot of times the spell and trap cards tell stories. And if you look closely at the art, you can even sort of match up different effects that the card maybe has to different elements of the artwork. One of my favorite really random old examples was Hyper Psychic Blaster. It's the synchro monster from like 2008, and when it attacks a monster, it like inflicts damage to your opponent and you gain life points. And the two weapons he has, like one of them's got a plus sign and one of them's got a minus sign, and I always thought that was really cool. And so now I look at Yu-Gi-Oh cards and try to find little things like that. It's very fun. Speaking of the artwork, by the way, Yu-Gi-Oh has got a lot of lore and storytelling to it. So basically every few years, Konami will release a new archetype that's kind of this ongoing story. One of the more recent ones was the Fallen of Albaz and Ecclesia story that basically became the whole branded archetype. But also right now we've got the Diabell Star, the Sinful Spoils story that's going on right now. And Konami recently announced that they're going to be making short animated videos as well that sort of tell these stories in an animated form, so that's going to be really cool. But yeah, even outside of the main lore archetype of any given time, like I said, if you look at any Yu-Gi-Oh card these days, there's some sort of a story involved there. Even some of the old monsters like Warrior Digrepher and like, Warrior Lady of the Wastelands are still having cards where like their stories are developing and they're having like this relationship, different stuff is happening, the old Goblin monsters and Marauding Captain. All of it's very much still there. All right, next reason is problem solving. I think my favorite part about Yu-Gi-Oh is that it is very much a problem solving game. You're given a certain set of tools at your disposal and you have to defeat your opponent with them. And that might sound really simple, but the way that Yu-Gi-Oh is oftentimes played today is through some very long and complicated combos where you have to navigate these properly. And if you're the opponent, you have to know where to interrupt your opponent's combos. Should I use a hand trap to stop this particular card effect? Should I maybe get rid of this monster that's on the field now, or should I wait until later? And if your opponent has an established board of different threats, maybe this thing can't be targeted, also this thing can negate a certain type of whatever, like you have to sort of navigate your way around different boards. And I think that that lock-picking, problem-solving element is something that really speaks to me personally. I love decks that can go second and break my opponent's board, but I also don't mind a deck that goes first and wrestles with your opponent's hand traps. Can you bait out some of their interruptions? All of this stuff I think makes Yu-Gi-Oh a really fun problem-solving game. So if your brain gets a fun tickle or an itch from that, then trust me, there's a lot to be had with Yu-Gi-Oh right now. Number 12, Yu-Gi-Oh's got a really thriving competitive scene. So a lot of card games are competitive, like, the goal is obviously to win, but with Yu-Gi-Oh, there is this established structure to the competitive scene. So, you've got your local level stores, but you also have regional tournaments that kind of will bring in people from around a state or around a region in the country. And then also you have nationals, you've got YCS events, you can qualify for worlds. It's a whole thing, and for a lot of games, I noticed that like people will get into the game, but then they find there aren't really like tournaments, or at least large tournaments near them. And so if you're one of the more competitive types who really wants to like prove themselves on a larger scale than just your small group of friends, Yu-Gi-Oh has that in spades. And even though people will sometimes complain about the metagame, or maybe they think that the prize support isn't good enough, there is an implicit just sort of value and satisfaction that you get from proving yourself among an entirely larger field of duelists than you've ever seen. Reason 13 is that there are multiple playstyles in Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of gets this reputation of being a game full of extremely long combos, and there are certainly lots of those, but you can actually play high-octane, fast combo decks as well as slower, more control, stun-based strategies. Decks where the focus is to restrict or limit what your opponent can do and disrupt them as opposed to just meeting their pace. You're kind of pulling them down to yours. And you've also got a variety of mid-range decks in between where it's sort of a bit of control, but also sort of a bit of aggression. And those are personally my favorite decks to play. Yeah, you can play fast, you can play slow, you can play middle of the road. Yu-Gi-Oh's got it all. And speaking of got it all, number 14 is that there are a lot of alternate win conditions in Yu-Gi-Oh! So outside of just sort of depleting your opponent's life points by attacking, there are decks that try to draw the 5 pieces of Exodia. There are decks that try to mill your opponent out, basically sending all their cards in their deck to the graveyard so that once they have to draw, they can't and they automatically lose. And there are other weird alternate win conditions as well. Like, you'd be surprised some of the strange gimmicks that this game offers. There are like Xyz monsters where they get a certain amount of materials, and once they get to 10, you automatically win the duel, or, you know, certain amount of counters on a card in the field. In addition to that, there's burn decks where you just try to like deplete your opponent's life points without attacking them. Reason 15 is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an evergreen game. So all of your favorite old cards are still playable. Yes, there is a ban list that you have to use when you're playing in tournaments, but outside of that small set of cards, the card pool in Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't ever really get rotated out. So if you have a favorite card from 2006 or 2012 or 2017, it is probably still just playable. Now, whether or not it's still good today, it's a different story, right? This game does very much have like power creep, so you have to, if you want to play an old theme, the cards are probably all still around, but you might have to update it with some newer cards. But still, I think that it's cool that like old cards that you buy don't completely lose all of their playable value. You can hold on to them and update those decks. Because I know a lot of card games kind of just tell you, yeah, if you haven't bought this thing from the last 2 years, it is literally unable to be played. Like, sure, in Yu-Gi-Oh! Some old deck from 2008 is probably not going to win today, but you can still play it and bring it to a tournament. Number 16 is that you can play Yu-Gi-Oh! Digitally, and this is actually one of my favorite things about the game right now. So if you don't want to play with physical cards because storing them and carrying them is difficult, or maybe you don't have a local card shop near you, because I hear about that a lot from people, you can actually just play Yu-Gi-Oh! Digitally. There's Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, which is kind of this simulator of just the regular master rules of the game that you're used to, and also Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, which is more of a like mobile-based card game. It's got a sort of simplified rule set. Yeah, playing Master Duel, playing Duel Links, they're great ways to just compete in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or get your Yu-Gi-Oh! Fix without having to leave the house, and they do have tournaments. People play in loads of tournaments like in-game, like the Kaiba Cup and the Duelist Cup, but also like just different fan tournaments people will run on Discord, and remote duel events and things like that. Okay, next, Yu-Gi-Oh's got a lot of budget options. I know that the headlines will tell you that there's some new $100 Yu-Gi-Oh! Card that you absolutely must have if you want any chance of winning, but the truth is, no, you don't actually have to always have the most expensive deck in the room. Sure, if you're playing at the national level, you want to have the very best cards available, and that can get pricey. But honestly, if you're just playing with your friends or you're just playing at your local card shop, you can build so many decks for less than $100, less than $50. There's even decks you can build for like less than $20. In fact, there are lots of videos dedicated to decks that you can build under a certain price point. You can just type it in on YouTube, like Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks under 50 bucks, you're golden. But if you do want to get the most expensive cards, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has reprints. So even if you can't buy the $100 staple card now, don't worry, in a few months, it'll probably just be reprinted. Right now, one of the best cards in the game is Molcharmy Fuwalos, and it currently costs something like $100, but it's also getting reprinted in a big reprint set come April, so it's going to be accessible to everybody. And that's one of the cool parts about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that cards just get reprinted. So if you're willing to be a little bit patient and like wait, it might take 6 months or 9 months or whatever, but these cards will become available again. I've also heard that there are some card games where this isn't the norm. Like once cards go out of print, they're not printed anymore, but Yu-Gi-Oh's not really like that. Reason number 19 is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Actually has a lot of classic formats. So if you find yourself overwhelmed with the modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Thing because there's a lot going on and lots of effects and cards and combos and all this crazy stuff, you can actually play older formats. For instance, GOAT format is based on the April 2005 version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where like Scapegoat was a really strong card. And it's an entire format. Like people do dedicated tournaments and stuff for it. That's a lot of fun. There's also a 2010 based format called Edison format. So basically, if you kind of have a more nostalgic golden age of Yu-Gi-Oh in your head, it's probably based around like one of these two periods of time. And there are other snapshot formats that people play. And when I say that like people play these, I'm serious. Like there are entire websites dedicated to different viable decks and strategies in these formats, as well as Time Wizard events that Konami actually runs at YCS's, where you can enter a dedicated tournament for a 2005 format or a 2010 format. So you don't just have to play modern Yu-Gi-Oh if you don't want to. You can sort of just dabble in the old stuff, and maybe when you feel ready, you could start trying to play modern Yu-Gi-Oh, or you could just never play it. You just play these decks forever if you really wanted to. Now, speaking of modern Yu-Gi-Oh, one of my favorite things about it is actually the pace. Now, this is very much a hot or cold issue. Some people hate that Yu-Gi-Oh duels can end very quickly, but I find that the brisk, kind of high-octane, intense interactive gameplay is one of my favorite parts about it. And what I mean by that is decks can do a lot with only a few cards. And what that means is that you have to be willing and ready to stop your opponent at any opportunity that you can. So your opponent's going to be trying to combo off, but you've got hand traps and things that you can use to stop them. There are cards that you can just send straight from your hand and negate your opponent's monster effects. But you got to make sure that you negate the right effect. And also, you can have multiples of these cards, but your opponent's also going to have multiple cards that they're going to be using to like push through those hand traps. And so I find that like high octane tug of war can be very exciting. It also means that comebacks can happen at any time in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, even if a board feels like it's impossible to surmount, once you use a certain card like a Dark Ruler No More or, Forbidden Droplet, Super Polymerization, you can clear your opponent's board or turn it off and then immediately turn the duel around. But modern Yu-Gi-Oh's fast push and pull is very fun and exhilarating once you get into it. It's tough to get into, but once you get into it, it's a lot of fun. Okay, the next thing is Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a very precise game. And what I mean by that is, obviously this game gets a bad rap for having these really long, complicated, convoluted card effects that you can't understand. But the truth is, that actually works to Yu-Gi-Oh's benefit. Because once you learn how to read a Yu-Gi-Oh card, you'll realize that every card is spelled out in very precise, clear terms. So Yu-Gi-Oh uses what's called problem-solving card text. Basically, the syntax that every card is written in is always consistent. So you'll always know what type of thing is in effect, what sort of thing starts a chain, what is a cost, and how cards are supposed to resolve, what lingering sort of locks or side effects or conditions that a card has attached to it. There's very little ambiguity in how a card is supposed to work in Yu-Gi-Oh, which means that once you understand it, you kind of can quickly understand and parse everything. And that might seem like a downside because it's like, wow, that's so complicated, I don't want to learn lawyer speak. But I find it's kind of a rewarding thing, especially because some people really value consistency in how things work in a game. And I've played other card games where there's a lot more ambiguity and stuff just sort of like, yeah, it just sort of depends on how you want to interpret it. So the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh has this structure in place, in my opinion, works really well and kind of scratches my ADHD brain in a good way. I like it. Next thing is, Yu-Gi-Oh is just really fun to collect. So even if you try the game out and maybe find that playing is too difficult for you or it's just not really your thing, you can also just collect Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And collecting is fun because there's a bunch of old cards that you can get, there's a bunch of new cards that you can get. So many cards are printed in different rarities and from different products. And so like, finding Starlight rare copies of cards or Quarter Century Secret rare copies of cards where they're just very blingy and flashy and fun, that's cool. Or just finding a favorite rarity of yours. Like I really enjoy collector's rares. It's this kind of rarity where like they've got this, I don't know how to describe it. It's like a weird like fingerprinty, glossy, embossed look to the cards. I also like ultimate rares, but some people prefer ghost rares. Just collecting Yu-Gi-Oh cards is fun. I've got an old school collection of cards that I've been building for years now, and I really like that. Some people like to collect some of the newer cards and different alternate arts like they've been making. There's so much. Like Yu-Gi-Oh's got so many cards to collect. You can never really even collect all the cards in the game, and you don't have to actually play at all, you can just collect them. Reason number 23 is that I find Yu-Gi-Oh to be a very therapeutic experience. Like just sort of opening packs, right? And like sorting cards out, sleeving, unsleeving, like slapping cards down on the mat and sliding them around. It's a weird sort of therapy for me, and I don't think that that's really something that'll apply to everybody. Some people are probably like, okay, you're a weirdo for that. But if you know, right? Like if you've played Yu-Gi-Oh and you know just like the fun and joy of like looking through a stack of cards, sorting things out, like, I don't know, I have a good time with that. I think that it's nice because it gets me away from a computer screen. I don't have to even necessarily be interacting with people. I can just have these cards, and like look through them and like look at some artwork and find something really cool about that, or like kind of try to like sort them in alphabetical order. All these different things. I like that sort of collecting and organizing aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! I find it very fun. Number 24, and I probably should have included this with the competitive section, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Provides a lot of travel opportunities if you are willing and able to take them. So obviously, going to locals, that can be like a 5, 10, maybe 30-minute drive for you. But when you start going to regional events and YCS events, you get to see a lot of really cool parts of the world. I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh's taken me a lot of different places. I've had events that are just one state away. I've had events that are several states away. In fact, if you are able to qualify for like Yu-Gi-Oh! Worlds, you can find yourself in Europe, you can find yourself in Japan, you can find yourself, if you're in one of those places, in America, and that could be considered like a cool, different location to be. I live in America, so it's not like all that surprising to me, but still there's a bunch of different states I haven't been to, and Yu-Gi-Oh's taken me to those places. So just the opportunity to travel, especially with a group of the friends that you made in this game, can be a lot of fun. It also takes some of the expense out of traveling, so you know, you can split hotel rooms, you can split gas and stuff like that. And reason number 25 is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been around for a very long time. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this game is celebrating its 25th anniversary for the 3rd year in a row. You don't have to worry or fear that this game is going anywhere. I've seen a lot of people start playing trading card games and just find that there's not a community for it, and it kind of just fizzled out in their area. And with Yu-Gi-Oh! You don't really have to worry as much about that. I mean, it's not perfect, like any, monumental thing can fall, but one of my favorite things about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the history that's there, and sort of this idea that like you're going to be sort of playing a game that's been built on the shoulders of people before you, and that was built on the shoulders of people before them. So yeah, the longevity that Yu-Gi-Oh! Offers, I think, is very much a plus. I mean, it made it 25 years after all. So yeah, that's 25 reasons to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Hopefully this was maybe a good bit of encouragement for some of you guys who were on the fence about taking the plunge. It really is a fun game. Don't let anybody tell you that it's awful and bad and you should avoid it. It's not a perfect game. It's got its problems, but I've been here, I've been playing, I like it, and I think that you would too. Yeah, okay, cool. So that's gonna be it. Drop a like if you enjoyed it, and also let me know down in the comments, what are any other reasons that somebody should play Yu-Gi-Oh? What's your favorite reason why you play Yu-Gi-Oh? Are you afraid to play Yu-Gi-Oh? If so, why? Maybe I can convince you otherwise. Okay, that's gonna be it. I'll see you in the next one. Pass turn.